it is what It is what it is.
A podcast wasn't even a thought back then.
The podcast was not even a thought back then. The podcast wasn't even on the table. Is there another thing there?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Thanks, guys. The podcast wasn't even a thought there. It's actually kind of funny when we think back to, like, the beginning of the podcast. We've, like, briefly mentioned that, but it was...
Branden and I brought that up, like, right when you were locked outside. We were actually going to talk about that.
Yeah, we were going to talk about it.
And then I just kept getting distracted by it. And then... He's just distant singing, and I'm like, he's singing.
Who was the original idea person?
Me.
He's like, I've always wanted to start a podcast. I've been thinking of doing it with my brother, and I'm like,
shout out you, bro.
I'm like, and then I'm like, why haven't you done it yet? And he's like, he just like, what?
Well, so me and my brother always talked about having a podcast, for years, like back in high school, honestly. Talked about having podcasts and doing it. We never started because of like space, equipment, all that stuff. And like my busy work schedule, his busy. Our schedule since high school never aligned ever. So and like he moved out and stuff, and like just him moving out and him starting his own life, it just couldn't start a podcast. And then I was working one day, and then
some idiot called him,
this dumbass, some dummy called me. Middle of work, man. Who calls someone during work?
I know, right? And then he just started. And then I was just like, it came up in a conversation. I don't remember exactly.
No, but he called me one day, the day that changed our lives forever. I say
not yet.
It will. It's coming. But he called me and he was like, "Hey, Branden, I haven't talked to you in a while. I just want to catch up, see how you doing." I'm like, "Oh, what are you doing?" He's like, "I'm working." I'm like, "Oh, I'm working too." He's like, "Oh, you could talk while you're at work?" I'm like, I was like, "Yeah, like I used to talk to some of my friends like working before calls and stuff." He's like, "I get lonely." I was like, "I get lonely too." He's like, "I'm gonna call you every day." So since that day,
I'm gonna call you every day.
So since that day, he called me every single day while I was working.
Right? Yeah, pretty much.
And then we were talking, like, just having conversations. And I don't know how we got in conversation of podcasts. I think we were maybe talking about a podcast.
Yeah, no. Like, actually, no. I think what we were talking about is like, it's like, you were talking about you wanted to create a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
And then it came up to a podcast as well.
Come soon, guys. I swear.
Yeah, sure. You were talking about that, and then like it went to the topic of a podcast, and then it's like, oh wait,